His name was Harry Farr. He was 25 years old. On the morning of January 18, 1916, he was tied to a wooden post in a field in France. 12 of his fellow British soldiers stood before him with loaded rifles. His crime, refusing to go back into the trenches. His sentence, death by firing squad. His actual condition, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Harry Farr wasn't a coward. He was one of 306 British soldiers executed during World War I for cowardice or desertion. Most of them were suffering from what doctors at the time called shell shock, what we understand today as severe psychological trauma. They weren't faking it. They weren't weak. Their minds had been shattered by the horrors of industrial warfare, and the British military killed them for it. This is the story of how the most devastating mental health crisis in military history was treated as a character flaw, and how thousands of soldiers paid the ultimate price for an illness no one understood. To understand what happened to these men, you need to understand what the Western Front actually was, and I don't mean the sanitized version from history class. Imagine this. You're 19 years old. You've been standing in a trench that's 4 feet deep in freezing mud for 3 weeks straight. The trench is so narrow you can't sit down. You're sharing this space with rats, the size of cats that feed on the corpses in no man's land. Every few minutes, German artillery shells explode around you. Not small explosions. These are massive howitzer shells that create craters 15 feet deep. When they hit near you, the concussive force makes your ears bleed. The ground shakes so violently you can't tell up from down. The man standing next to you gets hit. 1 second he's there, smoking a cigarette. The next second he's gone. Just gone. Vaporized by a direct hit. You can't leave. If you try to climb out of the trench without orders, you'll be shot by a sniper. If you refuse an order to go over the top to climb out and charge across no man's land toward enemy machine guns, you'll be court-martialed. You don't sleep. You can't. Every time you close your eyes, you hear the whistling of incoming shells. Every time you start to drift off, an explosion jerks you awake. You do this for days, then weeks, then months. This wasn't war as humans had ever experienced it. This was industrial-scale slaughter, and nobody, not the generals, not the doctors, not even the soldiers themselves, understood what it was doing to the human mind. By late 1914, just months into the war, British medical officers started seeing something they'd never encountered before. Soldiers were coming back from the front lines with symptoms that didn't make sense. They couldn't stop shaking. Violent, uncontrollable tremors that lasted for hours. Some men couldn't speak. They'd open their mouths, but no sound would come out. Others couldn't walk, even though their legs were uninjured. Some went blind or deaf, with no physical cause, and the nightmares. Soldiers would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, reliving artillery barrages that had ended weeks ago. They couldn't be around loud noises. A door slamming would send them diving to the ground, hands over their heads. By 1915, 10% of British officers and 4% of enlisted men were being discharged for nervous and mental shock. In 1915, a British psychologist named Charles Myers published a paper in the medical journal, The Lancet. He called this condition shell shock because he believed, like most doctors at the time, that it was caused by the physical concussive force of exploding shells. They thought the brain was being literally shaken inside the skull, causing microscopic damage. They were wrong, but that name, shell shock, stuck. The numbers were staggering. By 1916, 2 years into the war, shell shock cases were accounting for 40% of all British casualties from the Western Front. 40%, not from bullets or shrapnel, from psychological collapse. The military had a problem. They were losing more men to mental breakdown than to enemy fire, and they had absolutely no idea what to do about it. So they did what militaries always do when they don't understand something. They blamed the soldier. The British military's official position on shell shock was clear. It didn't exist. Or rather, it existed, but only in men who were already weak, cowardly, or predisposed to mental instability. Senior officers believed that real soldiers, men of strong character and good breeding, would never break down psychologically. Only weaklings did that. Therefore, if you were suffering from shell shock, it proved you were a coward. This wasn't just harsh. It was a death sentence. In a 1915 memo to medical officers, the British Army stated that shell shock was a manifestation of childishness and femininity. Those were the medical terms they used. Another memo instructed doctors to look for signs of malingering, faking illness to avoid duty. If a soldier couldn't stop shaking, couldn't control his tremors, couldn't speak, the assumption was that he was putting on an act. The thinking went like this: if shell shock is real, then it's caused by weak character. If it's caused by weak character, then it's the soldier's fault. And if it's the soldier's fault, then he deserves to be punished, not treated. This logic was applied at the highest levels. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, the commander of British forces on the Western Front, believed that shell shock was simply a failure of discipline. His solution: more discipline. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. Many of the soldiers being court-martialed for cowardice had been in continuous combat for months or even years. They'd already proven their courage dozens of times over. They'd charged enemy machine guns. They'd held positions under artillery bombardment. They'd watched their friends die. And then, when their minds finally broke under the unimaginable stress, they were told they were cowards, and some of them were executed for it. Let me tell you about Harry Farr, because his story represents hundreds of others just like him. Harry joined the British Army in 1908, 8 years before his execution. He wasn't drafted. He volunteered. By the time World War I started in 1914, he was already a trained soldier. He was sent to France in 1914 and spent the next 2 years in almost continuous combat. 2 years, in the trenches, under constant artillery fire, watching men die around him every single day. In May 1915, Harry was caught in a massive German artillery bombardment. The shelling went on for hours. When it finally stopped, Harry was found wandering in a daze behind the lines. He was shaking uncontrollably and couldn't speak coherently. The medical officer noted, suffering from nervous shock, symptoms consistent with shell shock. Recommend rest behind line. Harry was given a few days of rest, then sent back to the front. Because that's what they did. You got a few days, maybe a week, and then you went back. The war needed bodies. Over the next several months, Harry's condition got worse. He developed a severe tremor that he couldn't control. He would flinch violently at loud noises. He couldn't sleep. When he did manage to sleep, he'd wake up screaming. By September 1915, Harry was a wreck. His commanding officer noted that he was no longer fit for frontline duty, but instead of being discharged or moved to a rear position, he was ordered to keep fighting. On January 16, 1916, Harry's unit was ordered to move forward to the frontline trenches. When the order came, Harry refused, not out of cowardice. His body simply wouldn't obey him. He was shaking so badly he couldn't hold his rifle. He couldn't stop crying. He told his sergeant, "I can't go back there. I can't do it anymore." He was immediately arrested and charged with cowardice in the face of the enemy. His court-martial lasted less than an hour. There was no defense attorney, no psychological evaluation, no consideration of his 2 years of continuous combat service. The verdict was predetermined: guilty. Sentence: death. Harry's wife, Gertrude, wrote to the military authorities begging for mercy. She explained that Harry had been a good husband, a loyal soldier, and that he was clearly suffering from shell shock. Her letter was ignored. On January 18, 1916 at dawn, Harry Farr was tied to a post and shot by a firing squad made up of his own fellow soldiers. He was 25 years old. The army pinned a piece of paper to his uniform before he was shot. It read, "Coward." His widow was denied his pension. Because he'd been executed for cowardice, she wasn't entitled to military benefits. She spent the rest of her life fighting to clear his name. It took 90 years. Harry Farr was one of 306 British soldiers executed for cowardice or desertion during World War I. How many of them were suffering from shell shock? We'll never know for certain, but based on the records we do have, probably most of them. Harry Farr's story is tragic, but what makes it even more horrifying is that it wasn't unusual. 80,000 British soldiers were diagnosed with shell shock during the war. That's just the ones who were officially diagnosed. The actual number was almost certainly much higher, because many soldiers hid their symptoms, terrified of being labelled cowards, and Britain wasn't alone. Every army in World War I faced the same crisis. France had approximately 40,000 cases, Germany had 60,000 cases, the United States had 69,000 cases, total over 200,000 documented cases. The Germans called it Kriegszitten, war trembles. The French called it Obersite, shell damage. Every nation had their own name for it, but they all treated it the same way, as a failure of courage rather than a medical condition. The American military took a particularly harsh approach. When the U.S. entered the war in 1917, the army was determined not to repeat what they saw as European weakness. American military psychiatrists screened recruits and rejected anyone they thought might be susceptible to shell shock. It didn't work. Within months of entering combat, American soldiers were breaking down at the same rates as everyone else. By the end of the war, 69,000 American soldiers had been diagnosed with psychoneurosis. But here's what's crucial to understand. These weren't men who were weak or cowardly before the war. These were ordinary men, farmers, factory workers, teachers, shopkeepers, who had been subjected to a level of sustained trauma that the human mind simply wasn't built to handle. Think about it. In previous wars, battles happened, then they ended. Soldiers would fight for a few hours or maybe a day, and then there would be days or weeks of rest. But World War I was different. The Western Front was a continuous, ongoing battle that lasted for 4 years. 4 years of being under fire. 4 years of constant threat of death. No previous generation of soldiers had ever experienced anything like it, and the military medical establishment had no framework for understanding it, so they punished it instead. If you were diagnosed with shell shock and you weren't executed for it, what happened to you wasn't much better, because the treatments for shell shock were often as traumatic as the condition itself. The most common treatment, it was called disciplinary therapy. The idea was simple. Shell shock was caused by weak will, so the cure was to strengthen the will through discipline. What did that mean in practice? Soldiers suffering from shell shock were sent to special hospitals, where they were subjected to a regime of harsh discipline, physical exercise, and public shaming. Men who couldn't stop shaking were told to pull themselves together. Men who couldn't speak were told they were being childish. Men who woke up screaming were accused of disturbing other patients. But it gets worse. A British doctor named W.H.R. pioneered what he called rapid treatment for shell shock. His method, electrical shock therapy, but not the carefully controlled electroconvulsive therapy we use today. No, this was strapping patients down and applying painful electrical shocks directly to their throats, tongues, and vocal cords until they could speak again. In his own notes, Dr. Yearland describes one treatment session that lasted 4 continuous hours, 4 hours of electrical torture. He wrote, quite proudly, that the soldier recovered his speech by the end. Of course, the soldier spoke again. He was being electrocuted. Another treatment was called Faradization, using electrical current to force paralyzed limbs to move. The theory was that if you could force the muscles to work, you could break through the psychological paralysis. Some doctors used drugs, heavy sedation with morphine or barbiturates. This didn't treat the shell shock. It just knocked patients unconscious so they couldn't exhibit symptoms. And perhaps most cruelly, some shell shock victims were sent to asylums, locked away with severely mentally ill patients, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Families were told their soldier had gone mad and wouldn't be coming home. Approximately 7,000 British shell shock victims were sent to asylums, men who had served their country with honor, who had survived the most brutal conditions imaginable, were declared insane and locked away. And all of this was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what shell shock actually was. But not every doctor saw shell shock as cowardice. Some recognized it for what it truly was: a psychological injury caused by exposure to extreme trauma. Dr. William Rivers was a British psychiatrist who worked at Craiglockhart War Hospital in Scotland. Rivers took a radically different approach. He didn't believe his patients were cowards or malingerers. He believed they were suffering from legitimate psychological injuries that required treatment, not punishment. Rivers pioneered what we might recognize today as talk therapy. He had patients describe their traumatic experiences in detail, helping them process what they'd been through. He encouraged them to express their fears and anxieties rather than suppressing them. Most importantly, Rivers treated his patients with respect and compassion. He listened to them. He validated their experience. He told them that what they were feeling was a normal response to abnormal circumstances. Two of Rivers' most famous patients were the war poets Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon. Both men had been diagnosed with shell shock and sent to Craiglockhart. Under Rivers' care, both men were able to process their trauma and, remarkably, both chose to return to the front. Owen was killed in action just days before the war ended, but the poetry he wrote at Craiglockhart, describing the reality of shell shock and the horror of trench warfare, became some of the most powerful anti-war literature ever written. Rivers' approach proved that shell shock could be treated effectively with compassion and psychological understanding, but he was the exception, not the rule. Most shell shock victims never received treatment like his, and even Rivers didn't fully understand what he was dealing with. He knew shell shock was a psychological condition, but he didn't have the framework to understand it as what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. That understanding wouldn't come for another 60 years. By the time World War I ended in November 1918, the shell shock epidemic had reached catastrophic proportions. 65,000 British veterans were still receiving treatment for shell shock in 1929, 11 years after the war ended. Thousands more suffered in silence, unable to hold jobs, maintain relationships, or live normal lives. The governments that had sent these men to war now had to figure out what to do with them. After the war ended, the scale of the shell shock crisis became impossible to ignore. Hundreds of thousands of veterans were unable to return to normal life. They couldn't work. They couldn't sleep. They startled at loud noises, fought with their families, drank heavily to numb their symptoms. In the United States alone, the Veterans Bureau recorded 1.6 million disability claims related to psychoneurosis in the decade after the war. 1.6 million American soldiers whose minds had been damaged by what they experienced. Governments were forced to establish massive networks of veteran hospitals and treatment programs. The cost was staggering, billions of dollars in today's money. But no amount of money could give these men their lives back. And what about those 306 British soldiers who'd been executed? Their families were still fighting for recognition. The military refused to acknowledge that these men might have been suffering from shell shock when they were executed. The widows and children of executed soldiers were denied pensions. They were told their fathers and husbands had died as cowards. Some families kept the truth hidden for generations, too ashamed to reveal how their loved one had really died. In the 1920s and 30s, a few doctors and psychiatrists began calling for posthumous pardons. They argued that many of the executed men had clearly been suffering from shell shock and should not have been held responsible for their actions. The British government refused. It would take almost 90 years before they finally admitted what had been obvious all along. You'd think that after World War I, military leaders would have learned something about psychological trauma. You'd be wrong. When World War II broke out in 1939, the same patterns emerged. Soldiers broke down under the stress of combat, and once again many were accused of cowardice or malingering. The terminology changed. Now it was called battle fatigue or combat exhaustion. But the stigma remained. 504,000 American soldiers were discharged from World War II for psychiatric reasons. That's more than the number killed in combat. In the Korean War, the pattern repeated. Then came Vietnam. Vietnam veterans came home with rates of psychological trauma that dwarfed even World War I. They'd experienced guerrilla warfare, the constant threat of ambush, the horror of seeing civilians caught in combat. Many had been subjected to multiple tours of duty with little time to decompress between deployments. When they came home, they found a country that didn't want to hear about what they'd experienced. They were told to get over it, to move on, to be a man. Sound familiar? But something was different about Vietnam. Veterans began organizing, demanding recognition and treatment for what they were experiencing. Mental health professionals who worked with these veterans began documenting a consistent pattern of symptoms: intrusive memories, nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, avoidance of reminders of trauma. In 1980, 62 years after World War I ended, the American Psychiatric Association finally gave this condition an official name: post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Suddenly, what soldiers had been experiencing since World War I, since ancient times, really had a recognized medical diagnosis. It wasn't cowardice, it wasn't weakness, it wasn't malingering. It was a predictable psychological response to exposure to extreme trauma, a response that could happen to anyone, regardless of how brave or strong-willed they were. The shell-shocked soldiers of World War I had been right all along. They were injured, not in a way you could see on an X-ray, but injured nonetheless, and punishing them for those injuries had been one of the great injustices of the war. In the 1990s, a group of families who had lost relatives to execution during World War I began campaigning for official pardons. They argued that the 306 executed soldiers deserved to have their names cleared. The British government resisted for years. They argued that granting pardons would be rewriting history and would dishonor the military justice system. But the families persisted. And as understanding of PTSD grew, public opinion shifted. People began to realize that executing soldiers for shell shock had been a terrible mistake. Finally, in 2006, 90 years after Harry Farr's execution, the British government passed the Armed Forces Act, which granted posthumous pardons to all 306 soldiers executed for cowardice or desertion during World War I. Des Hughes, a campaigner whose great-uncle had been executed in 1916, said it's taken 90 years, but finally these men can rest in peace. Finally, their families don't have to carry the shame anymore. A memorial was erected at the National Memorial Arboretum in England. It shows a young soldier blindfolded, tied to a post. The inscription reads, "To the memory of the 30 other 6 British soldiers shot at dawn for military offences which would not now be recognised as deserving the death penalty." Harry Farr's name is on that memorial, so are 305 others. Gertrude Farr, Harry's widow, had died in 1974. She'd spent 58 years fighting to clear her husband's name. She never lived to see it happen. Today we understand PTSD in ways that World War I doctors couldn't have imagined. We know it's caused by changes in brain chemistry and neural pathways. We know it can be treated with therapy, medication, and support. We know it's not a sign of weakness. 11 to 20% of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans have PTSD. Approximately 8 million Americans have PTSD in any given year. But understanding PTSD and treating it effectively are two different things. Today, approximately 11 to 20% of veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan have PTSD. Many struggle to access treatment. Many face stigma. Even now, the suicide rate among veterans is staggering. In the United States, an average of 17 veterans die by suicide every single day. Many of them are suffering from PTSD. We've come a long way since 1916. We no longer execute soldiers for having PTSD. We recognize it as a legitimate condition. We have treatments that actually work, but we still have a long way to go, because every veteran struggling with PTSD today is dealing with the same fundamental trauma that broke Harry Farr in 1916, the psychological cost of war, and we owe it to them. We owe it to Harry Farr and those 305 other soldiers to do better. Harry Farr was 25 years old when he was executed for cowardice. He'd served his country for 8 years, He'd spent 2 years in the trenches on the Western Front. He charged enemy positions, held his ground under artillery fire, and watched countless friends die. When his mind finally broke under the unimaginable stress, when his body refused to let him go back into the hell of the trenches one more time, the British Army tied him to a post and shot him. They called him a coward. History calls him a victim. If you or someone you know is struggling with PTSD, please reach out for help. In the United States, you can contact the Veterans Crisis Line at 988, then press 1. In the UK, you can call Combat Stress at 0800 1. It's not cowardice. It's an injury. And like any injury, it deserves treatment, not judgment. The 306 soldiers executed during World War I never got that chance. But we can honor their memory by making sure today's veterans do. If you want to learn more about the medical mysteries that shaped military history, the next video covers how a different kind of enemy killed more World War I soldiers than bullets. Trench fever. It's a story about lice, disease, and how medical science raced to stop an invisible killer. Thanks for watching, and remember, understanding history helps us build a better future.